The chandeliers of Thornfield House blazed like 1,000 captured stars, their light spilling across silk gowns and polished marble, in a display of wealth so ostentatious it made Rose's teeth ache. She had once loved nights like this, the music, the dancing, the harmless flirtation hidden behind painted fans. That was before she understood how quickly glittering society could transform into a gilded cage. "Rose," Thomas Reed's voice cut through the waltz like a blade through velvet. "We need to speak. Privately." She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she murmured an excuse to Lady Pemberton and moved deeper into the crush of bodies, her heart hammering against her ribs. The orchestra swelled, violins climbing toward a crescendo that matched the rising panic in her chest. He followed. Of course he followed. Rose wove through clusters of gossiping matrons and preening gentlemen, her emerald gown whispering secrets to the floor. She could feel Thomas's presence behind her like a storm front, dark and inevitable. 3 months since she'd broken their engagement. 3 months of letters she refused to read, flowers she sent back wilted, visits she denied. 3 months of watching his obsession calcify into something far more dangerous than love had ever been. "You cannot avoid me forever," he called out, his voice rising above the music. Heads began to turn. "Your father's debts." Rose pushed through the ballroom doors and into the corridor beyond, her breath coming faster now. The sounds of the party muffled behind her, replaced by the hollow echo of her footsteps on stone. Thornfield House sprawled like a labyrinth, all shadowed hallways and closed doors that guarded the private lives of the peerage. She had attended enough gatherings here to know the layout, but panic had a way of scrambling memory. Left or right? The servants' quarters or the family wing? Behind her, the ballroom doors crashed open. "Rose!" Thomas's footsteps were heavy, purposeful, the boots of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. "There is nowhere left to run." She chose left, gathering her skirts in trembling fists as she ran. The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to judge her flight. A desperate woman fleeing through a lord's private halls, the scandal alone would ruin what little remained of her reputation. But reputation meant nothing to a corpse, and she had seen the madness flowering in Thomas's eyes these past weeks. He viewed her as a puzzle to be solved, a possession misplaced. A door appeared on her right, heavy mahogany with brass fittings that gleamed dully in the lamplight. Rose didn't hesitate. She threw herself against it, her shoulders screaming in protest as the door gave way. She stumbled inside, spinning to slam it shut behind her. Her fingers found the bolt and drove it home with a satisfying click. The silence that followed was absolute. Rose pressed her back against the door, her chest heaving, her carefully arranged hair beginning to slip from its pins. Outside, Thomas's footsteps slowed, then stopped. She could picture him standing in the corridor, his handsome face twisted with the peculiar rage of a man who believed the world owed him obedience. "I know you're in there." His voice was calm now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. "Do you think a door will keep me out? I have purchased your father's gambling debts, Rose. Every last one. The house in Mayfair, the country estate, even your mother's jewels. All of it belongs to me now. Which means you belong to me." Her stomach lurched. Papa's debts. She had known they were bad, but to have them weaponized like this. "Open the door, darling. We can discuss the terms of repayment like civilized people. Perhaps over dinner tomorrow? I've taken the liberty of having your belongings moved to my townhouse. Your father was most cooperative." Rose's hands clenched into fists. Of course Papa had been cooperative. He had been cooperative when he gambled away their fortune at the tables. Cooperative when he accepted Thomas's initial proposal on her behalf. Cooperative in every way except the one that mattered: protecting his daughter. "I will break down this door if I must," Thomas continued, and she heard something new creeping into his voice: eagerness. "You've led me on quite the chase, my dear, but every hunt must end." His fist hammered against the wood, making the heavy door shudder in its frame. It was then that Rose became aware of her surroundings. The room was dark, illuminated only by the dying embers of a fire in an enormous hearth. The scent of expensive brandy hung in the air, mingling with leather and something else, sandalwood perhaps, or cedar. Heavy curtains blocked what moonlight might have filtered through the windows. This was no parlor or sitting room, but a study. A private, masculine sanctuary she had invaded like a thief. And she was not alone. The realization came slowly, creeping up her spine like frost, a presence in the darkness, silent and still as death itself. She could feel eyes upon her, watching from the shadows near the fire. Her breath caught. "Please," she whispered to the darkness, to whatever specter or gentleman she had disturbed. "Please don't." Thomas's fist struck the door again, harder this time. "Rose, open this door immediately." From the shadows came movement. A figure rose from a high-backed chair, tall and broad-shouldered, backlit by the fire's crimson glow. Rose's hand flew to her mouth as the silhouette stepped forward, and she caught the barest glimpse of a face: sharp cheekbones, a cruel mouth, and a scar that ran from temple to jaw, like a crack in marble. "My lady," the figure spoke, and his voice was winter itself. "It appears we have a problem at the door." My lovely family, before we discover who's waiting in the shadows, please like, share, subscribe, and tell me in the comments section where you are watching from. Rose's breath froze in her lungs. The figure before her was carved from shadow and firelight, a study in contrasts that made her eyes struggle to focus. Tall, impossibly tall, she realized, as he took another step forward, with shoulders that blocked out what little illumination the dying embers provided. The scar she had glimpsed seemed to pulse in the darkness. A silvered line that spoke of violence survived. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I didn't know anyone was—" Thomas's fist crashed against the door again, making her jump. "Rose Everly, you are trying my patience. I will not be made a fool of in front of the entire ton." The man in the shadows tilted his head, and Rose caught the gleam of his eyes, pale, she thought. Though whether blue or gray, she couldn't tell. "Thomas Reed," he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice held the kind of certainty that came from a man who made it his business to know everything that occurred within his sphere. "Still bleeding at locked doors, I see. Some things never change." Rose pressed herself harder against the mahogany, trying to make herself smaller. She knew that voice now, had heard it mentioned in hushed whispers at tea parties and soirees, always accompanied by sidelong glances and nervous laughter. Alexander Ravenscroft, the Duke of Ravenscroft. The Dark Duke, they called him. The man who had vanished from society 5 years ago after a scandal no one would speak of directly, returning only for the most essential parliamentary duties before disappearing again into his northern fortress. And she had just burst into his private sanctuary like a common criminal. "Your Grace," she managed, dropping into a curtsy that her trembling legs barely supported. "I apologize most profusely for the intrusion. I was not aware this room was occupied, obviously." He moved closer, and Rose fought the urge to bolt. There was nowhere to go except back through the door, where Thomas waited like a wolf at a rabbit hole. Though I confess, it's been some time since a lady has thrown herself quite so literally into my company. The methods of modern courtship grow ever more dramatic. Was he jesting? The dry tone made it impossible to tell. Rose looked up, trying to see his face more clearly, but he remained carefully positioned so that the fire illuminated only his left side. The unmarred side, she realized. The scar twisted across his right cheek, pulling at the corner of his mouth and giving him a perpetually sardonic expression that might have been handsome on another man. Might still be handsome, whispered a traitorous part of her mind, if one was brave enough to look past the damage. I assure you, this was not an attempt at... Another crash against the door interrupted her. The wood groaned in protest, and she heard Thomas curse on the other side. He seems rather determined. The Duke moved to a sideboard, where crystal decanters caught the firelight like captured amber. He poured himself a measure of brandy with the unhurried grace of a man who had never been rushed in his life. Tell me, Miss Everly. It is Miss, is it not? Not Mrs. Reed? It is Miss. The words came out sharper than she intended. And it will remain so. Ah. He took a sip of his drink, studying her over the rim of the glass. Hence the theatrics. A lover's quarrel, then? Former fiancé. And it was not a quarrel. I ended our engagement months ago. He has refused to accept my decision, as evidenced by his rather persistent knocking. The Duke settled himself against the edge of his desk, utterly relaxed despite the chaos at his door. His legs were long, encased in black evening wear that seemed to drink in the light. Everything about him spoke of contained power, of a predator at rest. And now, you find yourself cornered in a strange man's study, having traded one potential scandal for another. Rose's hands clenched in her skirts. I did not ask for your commentary on my situation, Your Grace. Merely the temporary use of your door. My door has proven quite useful to you. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Though I wonder what you plan to do when Mr. Reed tires of knocking and begins to kick in earnest. This is Thornfield House, after all. Lord Pemberton's doors are solid, but not impenetrable. As if summoned by his words, a tremendous crash shook the frame. Thomas had evidently found something to use as a battering ram. Rose! Thomas's voice had taken on a manic edge. I can hear you in there. And whoever you're with, I'll see you ruined for this. Both of you. The Duke raised an eyebrow. Charming fellow. Whatever did you see in him? My father's debts. The admission burned on her tongue, but what did it matter now? Her reputation was likely already in tatters. Thomas offered to settle them in exchange for my hand. I was foolish enough to believe it was a fair exchange. And now? Now he owns them anyway. Purchased them from the creditors piece by piece, like a man buying up shares in a failing enterprise. Rose's voice cracked despite her best efforts. He says I belong to him, that my father's cooperation was most appreciated. The Duke was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Then he set down his glass with a soft click. Your father is a fool, he said conversationally. But then, most men are when it comes to cards and dice. They convince themselves that the next hand will be different, that fortune will smile upon them at last. They never consider who pays the price for their optimism. Another crash. The door's bolt was beginning to loosen from the frame. Rose straightened her spine, forcing steel into her voice despite the terror clawing at her throat. I should leave. This is not your concern, Your Grace, and I have already imposed enough upon your hospitality. Leave? He tilted his head, and the firelight caught the full extent of his scar, a vicious thing that started at his temple and carved down through his eyebrow. narrowly missing his eye before continuing to his jaw. It should have been grotesque. Instead, it lent him a dangerous beauty, like a sword with a notched blade. And go where, precisely? Through the door currently being demolished? Or perhaps through the window? We are on the second floor, but I suppose the fall might only break a leg or two. I will not be mocked. I am not mocking you. He pushed off from the desk and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Rose gasped, pressing herself against the door as he loomed over her. Up close, he was even more imposing, 6 feet and several inches of lean muscle and barely contained menace. The scent of sandalwood and smoke enveloped her. I am attempting to determine whether you are brave or merely desperate. What difference does it make? All the difference in the world. His hand came up, and she flinched before realizing he was reaching past her to touch the trembling door. Bravery can be cultivated. Desperation, however. He paused, his fingers splayed against the wood just above her shoulder. Desperation makes people useful. Rose's heart hammered. Useful to whom? To me. He smiled then, and it was a terrible thing, all sharp edges and calculated charm. Tell me, Miss Everly, how attached are you to your reputation? My reputation is already ruined. She forced herself to meet his eyes, those pale, piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through her. The moment I fled the ballroom with Thomas chasing me, I sealed my fate. If anyone saw— Oh, they saw. The Duke's voice held dark amusement. Lady Pemberton has eyes everywhere, and her guests are always hungry for fresh scandal. By tomorrow, every drawing room in London will be whispering about Rose Everly's desperate flight. The betting books at White's will have odds on whether you've already eloped with Reed or merely gone mad from the strain of broken engagement. Tears burned behind Rose's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Then what does it matter what I do now? I am already lost. Lost? He tested the word, rolling it around his tongue like fine wine. Such a final term. I prefer to think of it as unmoored, adrift, free from the constraints of society's expectations. His hand dropped from the door to his side. Tell me, what would you do if you had no reputation to protect? If the whispers and the scandal couldn't touch you? I would be free of Thomas Reed. The words came out fierce, feral. I would never see him again. Never hear his voice or feel his eyes upon me. I would go somewhere he couldn't find me and build a life that belonged to me alone. Ambitious? The Duke stepped back, giving her room to breathe. And utterly impossible given that he now holds your father's debts. He could have you arrested for theft if you tried to leave London. Could drag you through the courts, make a spectacle of your family's disgrace. I know what he could do. Rose's composure finally shattered. Do you think I haven't spent every waking moment these past months calculating my options? I have none. He has made certain of that. The door shuddered again, and this time she heard the distinct crack of splintering wood. The Duke's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A decision made, perhaps, or a gambit chosen. What if I told you there was a way out? Not an easy way, mind you. Not without cost. But a way nonetheless. Rose stared at him, afraid to hope. What way? Marriage. The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Not to Reed, obviously. To someone with enough power and influence to make Reed's purchased debts irrelevant. Someone whose protection would shield you from scandal and whose resources could crush any legal maneuvering your former fiancé might attempt. Her mouth went dry. You're suggesting— I am suggesting nothing yet. The Duke turned away from her, moving back to his brandy. Merely presenting a hypothetical. After all, we've only just met under rather unusual circumstances. It would be precipitous to make any firm decisions. "Why would you help me?" Rose demanded. "You don't know me. Don't owe me anything. What could you possibly gain from—" The door splintered. Not completely, but enough that Thomas's hand thrust through, grasping blindly for the bolt. "Fascinating question," the Duke murmured. Then louder, "I suppose we're about to find out." He strode to the door and, before Rose could protest, threw the bolt and yanked it open. Thomas Reed stumbled through, his cravat askew and his face flushed with exertion and rage. Behind him, Rose could see faces, so many faces, drawn by the commotion. Lord Pemberton looking scandalized, Lady Pemberton alight with vicious glee, and a dozen other guests crowding the corridor for a better view. Thomas's eyes found Rose immediately, burning with possessive fury. "There you are, you little—" He stopped short as he registered the Duke's presence. "Ravenscroft. I didn't realize you were in London." "Evidently." The Duke's voice was ice, though one might think the locked door suggested someone wished for privacy. "I don't give a damn about your privacy. That woman is mine, and I'll thank you to—" "Yours?" The Duke's eyebrow rose. "How fascinating. Miss Everly, are you this gentleman's property?" Rose found her voice. "No. And yet, he seems quite convinced otherwise." The Duke looked at Thomas with the expression one might give an especially stupid dog. "Tell me, Reed, on what precisely do you base this claim of ownership? Are we living in medieval times? Should I check for your brand upon her shoulder?" Thomas's face darkened. "Her father's debts. Ah, yes, debts." The Duke smiled his terrible smile. "I'm familiar with the concept, though I must confess, I've never before heard them used to justify kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Thomas sputtered. "I'm not. She's my fiancé." "Former fiancé," Rose interjected. "Was she?" The Duke turned to her, and there was a question in his eyes, a choice being offered. "How odd. Because I was under the distinct impression that Miss Everly was currently engaged to me." The silence that followed was absolute. The corridor erupted. Rose heard Lady Pemberton's scandalized gasp, saw the ripple of shock pass through the assembled guests like a stone thrown into still water. Thomas's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and something darker, something that made Rose's skin crawl with its intensity. "Engaged," Thomas repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "To you. Is there an echo in this corridor?" The Duke adjusted his cuff with infuriating nonchalance. "Yes, Reed. Engaged. To me. I realize the concept may be difficult for you to grasp, given your apparent belief that a woman's affections can be purchased along with her father's vows. But you're lying." Thomas took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "This is some kind of trick. Rose would never. She wouldn't." His eyes swung to her, wild and accusing. "Tell him. Tell him this is madness." Rose's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her mind raced, trying to understand what game the Duke was playing. He had offered her a hypothetical mere moments ago, and now he was announcing it to half of London's elite as established fact. She should deny it, should laugh it off as a misunderstanding, apologize to His Grace for the confusion, and face whatever consequences Thomas had planned for her with dignity. But the Duke's pale eyes held hers, and in them she saw something unexpected. Not mockery or cruelty, but a strange kind of patience. He was waiting, she realized, giving her the choice. He had opened the door, literally and figuratively, but she would have to be the one to step through it. "It's not madness," she heard herself say. The words felt foreign on her tongue, like speaking a language she'd only read in books. "His Grace and I, we have an understanding." The Duke's smile was almost imperceptible, a bare quirk at the corner of his damaged mouth. "Indeed we do." Thomas lunged. He didn't reach Rose. The Duke moved with a speed that belied his relaxed posture, intercepting Thomas mid-stride and catching him by the throat. It wasn't violent, precisely. There were no blows struck, no struggle. But the Duke's hand closed around Thomas's cravat with such casual certainty that the younger man froze like a rabbit in a snare. "I would advise," the Duke said softly, his voice pitched for Thomas alone, but carrying nonetheless in the shocked silence, "that you reconsider your next action. I am not a patient man, and I have very little tolerance for those who mistake my courtesy for weakness." "You have no right," Thomas choked out. "On the contrary, I have every right to defend my intended wife from unwanted advances." The Duke released him with a slight push that sent Thomas stumbling backward. "Or are you suggesting that a gentleman should stand idly by while his betrothed is accosted?" Lord Pemberton finally found his voice. "Ravenscroft, perhaps we should discuss this matter more privately. There's no need to provide entertainment for—" "Entertainment?" The Duke's attention swung to their host, and Pemberton actually retreated a step. "How curious. I announce my engagement, and you call it entertainment. Tell me, Pemberton, when your daughter became engaged last season, did you consider that entertainment as well? Or is it only scandalous when the bride in question has the poor taste to flee an unwanted suitor?" "That's not what I meant." "Then perhaps you should choose your words more carefully." The Duke's voice could have frozen blood. "Miss Everly has done nothing wrong. She sought sanctuary from a man who refuses to accept her rejection. A man who has been pursuing her with an intensity that borders on criminal obsession. That she found that sanctuary in my study is merely fortunate timing." Lady Pemberton pushed forward, her eyes glittering with malicious curiosity. "Fortunate timing, Your Grace? Or planned assignation? After all, you've been absent from society for so long. How would Miss Everly even know you, let alone agree to marry you?" It was a trap, elegantly laid. Rose felt it closing around them like a noose. If the Duke couldn't explain their connection, the entire story would collapse. They would be revealed as liars, and Rose's reputation would be destroyed beyond any hope of salvaging. But the Duke merely smiled, his terrible smile. "I see the years have not dulled your talent for insinuation, Lady Pemberton. As it happens, Miss Everly and I were introduced through correspondence. Her late mother and my own were dear friends before their respective marriages took them in different directions. When I learned of Miss Everly's situation, I thought it appropriate to extend my protection." Rose's breath caught. It was a masterful lie, impossible to verify, since both mothers were indeed deceased, but plausible enough to satisfy society's need for propriety. The late Mrs. Everly had been well connected before her marriage. It wasn't unreasonable that she might have corresponded with the previous Duchess of Ravenscroft. "Correspondence," Thomas spat. "How convenient. And when exactly did this correspondence lead to an engagement?" "I fail to see how that's any of your concern." The Duke's voice dropped to a temperature that made frost seem warm. "Miss Everly is not your property, Reed. Not your fiancé, not your chattel, not your anything. Whatever debts you've purchased, whatever schemes you've concocted, they are irrelevant. She is under my protection now." "Protection bought with lies." Thomas's voice rose, drawing more curious onlookers from the ballroom below. Rose could hear the whispers starting, the scandal spreading like fire through dry timber. You expect us to believe that the Dark Duke, who hasn't attended a social function in 5 years, suddenly developed a tundra for a disgraced woman he's never met? Mind your tongue, the Duke said quietly, or I will remove it from your mouth. The violence in those words was so casual, so absolute, that several guests actually gasped. Rose felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had heard rumors of the Duke's temper, of course. Whispers about what had really happened 5 years ago. The incident that had driven him from society. No one knew the full truth. But everyone agreed it had been violent. Thomas, to his credit or his stupidity, didn't back down. Show me the betrothal contract. If this engagement is real, there must be paperwork, announcements, something more than your word. My word, the Duke said softly, is worth more than your entire bloodline, Reed. But if you require proof... He turned to Rose, and she saw the question in his eyes again. This was the moment, the point of no return. If she confirmed his lie now, there would be no going back. Society would demand proof, as Thomas said. There would need to be contracts, settlements, a formal announcement in the Morning Post. There would need to be a wedding. The announcement will appear in tomorrow's papers, Rose said, her voice steadier than she felt. Our family's solicitors have been drawing up the settlements for the past fortnight. I apologize for the deception, but given Mr. Reed's persistence, we felt it prudent to keep the matter private until the legalities were settled. It was the Duke's turn to look impressed. She had not only confirmed his lie, but expanded upon it, adding details that would buy them time. Solicitors could be bribed or persuaded. Papers could be forged. By the time anyone thought to verify her claims, they could have the actual documents prepared. If, that is, the Duke truly intended to go through with this insane charade. Lady Pemberton's face had gone tight with frustration. She had smelled blood in the water, but the prey had proven more difficult to catch than anticipated. Even so, Your Grace, surely you can understand our confusion. An engagement conducted entirely in secret, announced only when the bride-to-be is discovered fleeing through private corridors, fleeing an unwanted suitor, the Duke interrupted. Let us be clear about the sequence of events, Lady Pemberton. Miss Everly was pursued by Mr. Reed despite her repeated refusals of his company. She sought refuge in the nearest available room, which happened to be the study where I was reviewing some documents for Lord Pemberton. The fact that I was able to defend my betrothed from harassment is hardly scandalous, unless you believe a woman should simply submit to any man who claims ownership of her debts. The assembled guests shifted uncomfortably. The Duke had turned the narrative expertly, transforming what might have been seen as Rose's disgrace into Thomas's villainy. Several of the older matrons were now looking at Thomas with open disapproval, their sense of propriety offended by his aggressive pursuit. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all return to the ballroom. I'm sure this matter can be resolved with calmer heads and fewer witnesses. An excellent suggestion. The Duke offered Rose his arm, and she took it on trembling legs. His forearm was solid beneath her fingers, radiating warmth through the fine fabric of his coat. Miss Everly and I will take our leave. It has been a trying evening, and I believe my intended could use some rest. You can't just... Thomas started forward again, but this time it was Lord Pemberton who stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. Enough, Reed. You've made enough of a spectacle for one evening. A spectacle? Thomas's laugh was wild, unhinged. He's stealing her. Can none of you see that? The debts are mine. She's mine. The debts, the Duke said, his voice cutting through Thomas's hysteria like a blade. "Will be settled. Send your accounting to my solicitor. I assume you know where to find him. Any legitimate debts owed by the Everly family will be paid in full, with interest. After that, Mr. Reed, I suggest you find some other young woman to terrorize. Miss Everly is no longer available for your amusement." He began to walk, and Rose moved with him, her hand still clutching his arm like a lifeline. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses, faces blurring together in a mixture of shock, scandal, and avid curiosity. She heard the whispers starting already. The Dark Duke. Can you believe? 5 years, and he returns for her. That scar, did you see? Poor thing, from one disaster to another. They descended the grand staircase, the Duke's pace measured and unhurried despite the chaos they'd left behind. Rose's mind spun with the enormity of what had just happened. In the space of mere minutes, she had gone from ruined woman fleeing her obsessed former fiancé to the betrothed of one of England's most powerful and reclusive peers. It wasn't real, she reminded herself. It was a performance, a gambit to save her from Thomas's clutches. The Duke had said himself that desperation made people useful. She was clearly useful to him in some way, though she couldn't yet fathom how. They reached the entrance hall, where servants scrambled to fetch the Duke's coat and hat. Rose realized with a start that she had no wrap, no police. She had fled the ballroom with nothing but the clothes on her back. As if reading her thoughts, the Duke shrugged out of his greatcoat and draped it over her shoulders. It was far too large, swallowing her frame. But it was warm and smelled of sandalwood and safety. "Your Grace," she whispered as the servants bustled about. "What have we just done?" "We," he replied softly, his pale eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath, "have just declared war on Thomas Reed and society itself. I do hope you're prepared for the consequences, Miss Everly, because there is no retreating from this battlefield." The Duke's carriage appeared at the base of the steps, black as midnight and emblazoned with the Ravenscroft crest, a raven clutching a sword in its talons. The footman opened the door, and warm light spilled out onto the rain-slicked stones. Rose looked back at Thornfield House, at the golden windows where she knew Thomas was watching, plotting, seething. Then she looked at the Duke, at this scarred stranger who had just upended her entire existence for reasons she didn't understand. "I am prepared," she lied, and stepped into the carriage. The Duke followed, settling himself across from her with the fluid grace of a predator. The door closed with a decisive thud, sealing them in together. Through the window, Rose watched Thornfield House recede as the carriage rolled forward into the rain-dark streets of London. "You said desperation makes people useful," she said, breaking the silence. "What use am I to you, Your Grace? Why did you really claim me as your betrothed?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his face half-shadowed in the dim carriage light. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "Because, Miss Everly, I need a wife, and you need a monster to slay your demons. I suspect we can help each other achieve both." The carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones, a rhythmic percussion that filled the silence between them. Rose pulled the Duke's greatcoat tighter around her shoulders, acutely aware of how small she must look drowning in its folds. Across from her, Alexander Ravenscroft sat perfectly still, his long legs stretched out in the confined space, his scarred face half turned toward the window where rain streaked down the glass like tears. "A monster to slay my demons," Rose repeated, tasting the words. "That's quite a dramatic turn of phrase, Your Grace. I thought it suited the evening's theatrics." His pale eyes slid back to her, assessing. Though perhaps you prefer plain speaking? Very well. I need to rehabilitate my standing in society. You need protection from a man who believes he owns you. We can provide each other with what we require, provided we're both willing to pay the price. And what price is that? For you? Marriage to a man you don't know. A man society calls the Dark Duke, who hasn't been seen at a proper social function in 5 years. A man with a ruined face and a reputation for violence. He touched the scar almost absently, tracing its path from temple to jaw. You would become the Duchess of Ravenscroft, with all the privilege and isolation that entails. Rose studied him in the flickering carriage light. He spoke of his disfigurement so casually, as if discussing the weather rather than the wound that had clearly altered his life. And your price? Acceptance? Patience? The willingness to play the role of devoted wife in public while maintaining whatever distance you prefer in private. He leaned forward slightly, his intensity suddenly focused entirely upon her. I will not force myself upon you, Miss Everly. Let me be abundantly clear on that point. Whatever marriage we contract will be one of convenience and mutual protection. Your chambers will be your own. Your person will remain inviolate. I require only the appearance of matrimonial harmony. Why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Why do you need to rehabilitate your standing? You're a duke. You have power, wealth, influence. What does society's opinion matter to a man like you? His smile was bitter. Even dukes have masters, Miss Everly. Mine is the crown, and the crown has made it abundantly clear that my continued absence from civilized company reflects poorly on the peerage as a whole. There are parliamentary matters that require my presence, committees that need my vote, and a rather insistent Lord Chamberlain, who has suggested that my self-imposed exile borders on dereliction of duty. So you need a duchess to make you respectable. In essence, he sat back again, his expression unreadable. A wife softens a man's image, suggests he is capable of normal human connection rather than being the gothic villain the scandal sheets have painted me as. With you on my arm, I become merely eccentric rather than dangerous, reformed rather than ruined. Rose turned his words over in her mind, looking for the trap. Men like the Duke of Ravenscroft did not offer sanctuary without reason, and she had learned the hard way that even the most generous-seeming bargain could hide sharp teeth. What happened 5 years ago? What drove you from society? That, he said softly, is not part of our negotiation. You expect me to marry you, but you won't tell me why you left London? I expect you to decide whether the protection I offer is worth the mysteries I keep. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. We all have secrets, Miss Everly. I will not pry into yours if you extend me the same courtesy. The carriage turned a corner, and Rose glimpsed the Thames through the rain-streaked window, dark and serpentine in the night. She thought of Thomas's face twisted with possessive rage, of the debts he had purchased like chains to bind her, of the hollow look in her father's eyes when he had told her there was nothing left to sell but her hand in marriage. How long? She asked. How long would this arrangement last? A year, perhaps 2? Long enough to satisfy the Crown's requirements and secure my position. Long enough to see your father's debts settled and Thomas Reed's legal claims nullified. He paused. After that, if you wish to seek an annulment, I will not oppose it. You would retain your title and a generous settlement. Your freedom, such as it is, would be yours again. An annulment requires proof that the marriage was never consummated. Hence my earlier assurance about separate chambers. His tone was dry. I am many things, Miss Everly, but I am not a man who takes what is not freely offered. Rose's hands twisted in the fabric of his coat. It was a mad proposition. Insane. She would be trading one form of captivity for another, exchanging Thomas's obsessive pursuit for the Duke's cold arrangement. And yet, there was a vast difference between a man who saw her as property and one who saw her as a partner in a calculated bargain. What about children? The question made her cheeks burn, but it had to be asked. Heirs? Surely you need. I have cousins. The line of succession is secure. He waved a dismissive hand. Besides, I have no intention of inflicting my particular brand of misery on another generation. The Ravenscroft line can die with me for all I care. There was such bleakness in those words that Rose found herself looking at him more closely. Beneath the aristocratic bearing and the careful control, she glimpsed something raw. Not quite pain. The Duke seemed far too practiced at burying his emotions for that. But a profound isolation that matched her own. You said we could help each other, she said slowly. But it sounds as though you're offering me far more than I can offer you. Protection from Thomas, settlement of my father's debts, a title, an eventual annulment with financial security. All you're asking for, in return, is my presence at social functions and the appearance of domestic tranquility. That's hardly an equitable exchange. Isn't it? The Duke's expression shifted, something almost like respect flickering across his features. You underestimate what you bring to this arrangement, Miss Everly. You are young, beautiful, well-bred despite your father's gambling. You fled an abusive situation with courage rather than submitting to it. Society will see you as my redemption, the gentle lady who tamed the beast. Your very presence will rehabilitate my reputation in ways gold cannot buy. I'm not gentle, Rose said flatly, and I have no interest in taming anyone. Even better. His smile was genuine this time, transforming his scarred face into something almost handsome. I have no use for simpering misses who faint at raised voices. I need a woman with steel in her spine, someone who can face down the ton's whispers and Thomas Reed's inevitable retaliation without crumbling. The carriage slowed, and Rose realized they had arrived at a townhouse in Mayfair. Not the largest on the street, but undeniably elegant. Gas lamps flanked the entrance, casting golden light across black-painted doors and pristine white columns. This is my London residence, the Duke said. Small by some standards, but it suits my needs. You would stay here tonight. Tomorrow, if you agree to my terms, we will see the solicitors and make the necessary arrangements. If you decline, he shrugged. I will have my carriage take you wherever you wish to go, though I strongly advise against returning to your father's house. Thomas Reed will be waiting. Rose looked at the townhouse, then back at the Duke. And if I agree, what happens next? We marry. Quickly, quietly, with a special license to avoid the bans. Within a week, you will be the Duchess of Ravenscroft. He opened the carriage door, letting in a gust of rain-scented air. We will attend a few select social functions to establish our connection, then retreat to my estate in Northumberland. Ravenscroft Manor is remote, defensible, and entirely self-sufficient. Thomas Reed would be a fool to follow us there, and I do not tolerate fools on my land. You make it sound like a military campaign. In many ways, it is. He stepped down from the carriage and turned to offer her his hand. So tell me, Miss Everly, do you accept the terms of our arrangement? Will you become my Duchess and help me wage war against society's expectations? Rose stared at his outstretched hand. It was large, scarred across the knuckles, and steady as stone. Behind her lay the life she had known, trapped between her father's weakness and Thomas's obsession, with no choices and no future. Before her lay the unknown, a strange duke with secrets and scars, offering her a bargain that might be salvation, or simply a different kind of prison. But at least it was a prison with locked doors that she held the key to. She placed her hand in his and let him help her down from the carriage. The rain had softened to a mist that clung to her hair and skin, and the cobblestones were slick beneath her dancing slippers. "I accept," she said, her voice clear despite the trembling in her limbs. "With conditions." His eyebrow rose. "Conditions? How delightfully unexpected. You said you would not pry into my secrets, and I have extended you the same courtesy regarding your past. That must remain inviolate. No questions about what happened before we met." "Agreed. Furthermore, while I understand the need for public displays of affection, I require your word that you will never use your physical strength to intimidate me. I have had quite enough of men who believe size equals authority." "You have my word?" His expression had gone serious. "I will never raise my hand to you in anger, Miss Everly. Whatever else I am not Thomas Reed." Finally, she drew a breath, committing herself fully to this mad course. "When the time comes to end this arrangement, I want your assistance establishing myself independently. Not just money. I want connections, references, the means to make my own way in the world. I will not trade one form of dependence for another." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. Then he smiled that terrible, beautiful smile and raised her hand to his lips. The kiss he pressed to her knuckles was formal, correct, and yet somehow felt like the sealing of a pact far more binding than any marriage contract. "You continue to surprise me," he murmured. "Very well. When our arrangement concludes, I will ensure you have the means to live as you choose. Independence, anonymity if you wish it, and enough funds to never be at any man's mercy again." "Then we have an accord, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected. "If you are to be my wife, you should at least use my given name when we are private." "Alexander?" She tested the name, found it suited him, sharp and strong with an edge of danger. "And you may call me Rose." "Rose." He offered her his arm again, escorting her toward the townhouse entrance where a butler already waited with the door open. "Tell me, are you always this practical when accepting marriage proposals? Or is this a special occasion?" "This is my first proposal involving a fake engagement, a public scandal, and a flight from an obsessed former fiancé," she replied. "I'm improvising." His laughter was startling, a rich, genuine sound that seemed surprised from him. "Then I shudder to think what you might accomplish with actual planning." They crossed the threshold together, leaving the rain and the night behind. The entrance hall was elegant but understated, all dark wood and subdued colors. A far cry from the ostentatious displays of wealth Rose had grown accustomed to in London's grander houses. A housekeeper appeared, gray-haired and efficient, her expression carefully neutral as she took in Rose's disheveled state and the Duke's protective posture. "Mrs. Hartwell," Alexander said. "This is Miss Rose Everly, my betrothed. She will be staying with us. Please prepare the blue chamber and see that she has everything she requires." If Mrs. Hartwell was surprised by this announcement, she hid it admirably. "Of course, Your Grace. Miss Everly, if you'll follow me." Rose hesitated. Looking back at Alexander, now that the arrangement was made, she felt suddenly adrift. What had she done? Agreed to marry a stranger? To live in his isolated manor? To play the role of devoted duchess to a man society called a monster? As if sensing her uncertainty, Alexander touched her hand briefly. You are safe here, Rose. Whatever else happens, know that. Thomas Reed cannot reach you behind these walls. It wasn't love or even affection in his voice. It was something simpler and perhaps more valuable. Certainty. The Duke of Ravenscroft was a man who kept his word. Thank you, she said softly. Alexander. She followed Mrs. Hartwell up the sweeping staircase, acutely aware of Alexander's gaze tracking her progress. When she reached the landing and looked back, he was still standing in the entrance hall, half shrouded in shadow, his scarred face turned up toward her. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Then he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of partnership, and turned away toward what she assumed was his study. Rose continued to her assigned chamber, her mind spinning with the enormity of what she had agreed to. In the span of a single evening, she had fled one man and bound herself to another. She had become a duchess-in-waiting, a participant in an elaborate deception, a player in a game whose rules she was still learning. The blue chamber was beautiful, all soft fabrics and gentle colors, with a fire already crackling in the hearth. Mrs. Hartwell helped her out of the ruined ball gown, provided a nightdress and washing water, and departed with promises of breakfast in the morning. Alone at last, Rose sank onto the edge of the bed and let herself shake. She had been so strong, so pragmatic during the negotiations with Alexander. But now, in the quiet dark, the terror caught up with her. She had agreed to marry a man she didn't know. A man with secrets and scars and a reputation for violence. A man who needed her to rehabilitate his image, though she still didn't understand why he had fallen from grace in the first place. But he had also given her something she had thought lost forever. Choice. The choice to refuse Thomas Reed. The choice to determine her own future, even if that future was bound by the terms of their arrangement. And perhaps most importantly, he had promised her eventual freedom. Rose lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling where firelight cast dancing shadows. Tomorrow she would meet with solicitors. Within days, she would be married. Within a week, she would leave London for the wilds of Northumberland in a manner that sounded more like a fortress than a home. It should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time in months, Rose felt something that might have been hope. The journey north took 5 days. 5 days of rutted roads and rain-lashed countryside, of coaching inns where the Duke's crest commanded the best rooms and the whispers followed them like ghosts. 5 days of sitting across from her new husband, for they had married with indecent haste. A special license procured and a brief ceremony conducted in Alexander's private chapel, and learning the contours of his silence. Alexander was not, Rose discovered, a man given to idle conversation. He read during their travels, dense parliamentary documents and letters sealed with various noble crests, his scarred face impassive as the landscape rolled past. Occasionally he would look up and find her watching him, and something that might have been amusement would flicker in his pale eyes before he returned to his papers. She wore his ring now. Heavy gold set with a dark sapphire that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Ravenscroft ring, Mrs. Hartwell had told her while helping her dress for the ceremony. Worn by every duchess for the past 200 years. It felt like a shackle. The announcement had appeared in the Morning Post exactly as promised. His Grace the Duke of Ravenscroft is pleased to announce his marriage to Miss Rose Everley, daughter of the late Mrs. Margaret Everley and Mr. James Everley of Mayfair. Brief, proper, and utterly final. Thomas had sent 3 increasingly unhinged letters to Alexander's townhouse, each one more threatening than the last. Alexander had read them over breakfast with the same detached interest he might show a mildly entertaining play, then fed them to the fire. "He has no legal recourse?" Alexander had said calmly, buttering his toast. "The debts have been settled. Your father has been relocated to a comfortable cottage in Bath, and you are now a duchess. Reed can bluster all he likes, but he is powerless." Powerless. The word should have brought Rose comfort. Instead, it made her think of cages with golden bars. Now, as the carriage crested yet another hill, she caught her first glimpse of Ravenscroft Manor and felt her breath catch in her throat. It was not a manor. It was a fortress. Built of dark stone that seemed to drink in the gray northern light, the structure loomed against the sky like something from a Gothic novel. Crenellated towers rose at each corner, and the windows were narrow slits that suggested defense rather than hospitality. A curtain wall surrounded the main building, and beyond it, Rose could see the wild moors stretching toward distant mountains, empty of human habitation. "Good God," she breathed. "You live here?" Alexander looked up from his papers, following her gaze. "I do. Ravenscroft Manor has stood for 400 years, built during the border wars when raids from Scotland were common. My ancestors believed in being prepared. It looks like a prison, or a sanctuary." His expression was unreadable, depending on one's perspective. The carriage rolled through an iron gate, opened by a grizzled man who touched his cap to Alexander with what looked like genuine respect, and into a cobbled courtyard. Servants appeared from a side entrance, moving with quiet efficiency to collect the trunks and bags. They were older than the staff in London, Rose noticed. Weathered and practical, with the sturdy builds of people accustomed to hard work. A tall woman descended the main steps, her gray hair pulled back severely, her dress black bombazine that rustled with starch. She surveyed Rose with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and Rose found herself straightening her spine under that assessing gaze. "Your Grace," the woman said to Alexander as he emerged from the carriage. "Welcome home." "Mrs. Blackwood." Alexander helped Rose down with a hand that was steady despite the long journey. "May I present my wife, the Duchess of Ravenscroft." "Rose, this is Mrs. Blackwood, the manor's housekeeper. She has been with my family since before I was born and runs the estate with considerably more efficiency than I could manage alone." Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened fractionally. "Your Grace," she said to Rose, dropping a curtsy that seemed more acknowledgement than deference. "Your rooms are prepared. I trust you'll find them satisfactory." "I'm sure they'll be lovely," Rose managed, though lovely seemed an unlikely word to apply to anything in this austere fortress. The interior was a surprise. While the exterior promised medieval grimness, someone, Alexander's mother, perhaps, had softened the interior with rich fabrics and warm colors. The great hall soared 2 stories high, its stone walls hung with tapestries depicting various historical scenes. A massive fireplace dominated one end, large enough to roast an ox, and the wooden beams overhead were carved with intricate designs that spoke of craftsmen long dead. But despite the attempts at warmth, the space felt empty. Too large for the few servants she'd seen, too quiet for a living home. It felt like a mausoleum dressed up as a residence. "The family wing is this way," Alexander said, guiding her up a broad staircase. "Your chambers adjoin mine, though there is a connecting door that can be locked from your side if you prefer. The library is on the ground floor, You're welcome to make use of it. The gardens. He paused. There are no gardens to speak of. My mother attempted one once, but the northern climate defeated her efforts. They reached a corridor lined with portraits, generations of Ravenscrofts staring down with varying degrees of severity. Alexander stopped before a heavy oak door and pushed it open, revealing a suite of rooms that took Rose's breath away. Unlike the stark grandeur of the public spaces, these chambers were intimate. A sitting room done in shades of deep blue and cream, with comfortable chairs arranged before a fireplace already blazing with warmth. Beyond it, visible through an open doorway, she could see a bedroom with an enormous four-poster bed draped in silk. Windows, larger here than elsewhere in the manor, overlooked the moors, and the late afternoon light streamed through them in shafts of gold. I had these rooms prepared specifically for you, Alexander said, and there was something uncertain in his voice. If they don't suit, Mrs. Blackwood can make changes. Rose walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The view was breathtaking, wild and empty, and utterly unlike the manicured parks of London. No other houses dotted the landscape. No roads or fences marked human ownership. Just endless moors stretching toward the purple shadows of distant fells. It's beautiful, she said softly. And terrifying. Yes. He came to stand beside her, and she could feel the heat of him despite the space between them. I felt the same when I first returned here 5 years ago. Like the loneliness might swallow me whole. It was the first personal thing he had said about his exile, and Rose turned to look at him. In the afternoon light, his scar was less dramatic. A raised line of silvered tissue that spoke of violence survived. His pale eyes were fixed on the moors, and his expression was distant. "Why did you come back here?" she asked. "After whatever happened in London? Why retreat to such an isolated place?" "Because isolation was preferable to pity." His jaw tightened. The stares, the whispers, the way conversations would stop when I entered a room. At least here the only witnesses to my disgrace were the sheep and the ravens. "You're not disgraced." "Aren't I?" He looked at her then, and she saw the bitterness beneath his careful control. "I am the Dark Duke, Rose. The monster in society's closet. The cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters about what happens to men who let their tempers rule them." "What did happen?" "I thought we agreed not to pry into each other's pasts." His voice had gone cold, distant. The brief moment of vulnerability shuttered closed as effectively as a locked door. Rose felt the isolation of this place settle over her like a shroud. 5 days in a carriage with a stranger, now trapped in a fortress on the edge of nowhere, bound to a man who kept his secrets as carefully as a miser hoarded gold. The weight of it pressed down on her lungs, making it difficult to breathe. "I need some air," she said abruptly. "Is there somewhere I can walk?" Alexander studied her for a moment, then nodded. "The battlements are accessible from the tower stairs. The views are impressive, and you won't be disturbed. Dinner is at 8. Mrs. Blackwood will send someone to help you dress." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Rose stood alone in her beautiful prison, watching the shadows lengthen across the moors, and wondered what she had truly agreed to. The battlements were exactly as forbidding as she'd expected. Narrow stone walkways bordered by crenellated walls, exposed to the wind that howled across the moors with nothing to stop it. Rose wrapped her shawl tighter and walked the perimeter, her hair whipping free of its pins. Below, she could see the manor's layout, the main keep, the outer buildings that housed stables and storage. the kitchen garden that was the only sign of cultivation in this wild landscape. Beyond the walls, the moors stretched endlessly, and Rose understood why Alexander had chosen this place. Here he was truly alone, untouchable, safe from society's judgment. But safety could become its own prison. She was turning back toward the tower entrance when she noticed a figure in the courtyard below. Alexander, she realized, speaking with an elderly man who leaned heavily on a walking stick. As she watched, Alexander took the man's arm and helped him toward one of the outbuildings, his movements gentle and patient. Curious, Rose descended the tower stairs and followed at a discreet distance. The building Alexander had entered appeared to be a converted stable. Rose peered through a window and felt her breath catch. Inside, the space had been transformed into a kind of workshop, with benches lined with tools and materials. But more striking were the people. A half-dozen men and women of various ages, several bearing obvious injuries or disabilities. A young man with one arm worked at a lathe. A woman with a twisted leg sat carefully painting what looked like wooden toys. The elderly man Alexander had helped was now settled in a chair by the fire, a satisfied smile on his weathered face. Alexander moved among them with ease, stopping to examine the young man's work, to exchange words with the woman that made her laugh. There was no hauteur in his manner, no aristocratic distance. He touched the old man's shoulder with casual affection and accepted a carved figure from a boy who couldn't have been more than 12. Rose watched, transfixed. This was not the cold duke who had married her out of convenience. This was someone entirely different, someone capable of tenderness and care. "They're his tenants," Mrs. Blackwood's voice said from behind her, making Rose jump. The housekeeper had appeared with her usual silent efficiency. "The ones who can't work the land anymore, injured or ill or simply too old. His Grace set up the workshop so they'd have purpose. Sells what they make in the local markets and gives them the profits. I didn't realize I thought he was a recluse. With society, yes. With his people." Mrs. Blackwood's stern face softened. "He takes care of his own, Your Grace. Always has. When the fever swept through the village 3 winters past, he turned the great hall into a hospital. Brought in doctors from Edinburgh, paid for everything himself. Lost 2 men anyway, and I found him weeping in the chapel afterward." Rose looked back through the window, seeing Alexander with new eyes. Why does he hide this? Why let society think him a monster when he's capable of such kindness? Because kindness is a vulnerability, and His Grace learned young that showing weakness invites attack. Mrs. Blackwood's expression turned grim. What happened in London 5 years ago, it wasn't his fault. But try telling that to people who already wanted to believe the worst of him. What did happen? That's not my story to tell. The housekeeper's tone brooked no argument. But I will say this. You could have done far worse than Alexander Ravenscroft, Your Grace. He's a good man, for all his scars and secrets. Give him time, and he might surprise you. Mrs. Blackwood departed as silently as she'd arrived, leaving Rose alone with her churning thoughts. She returned to her chambers as dusk fell, finding that someone had unpacked her trunks and laid out an evening gown. The dress was one of her finer pieces, deep burgundy silk that complemented her complexion. She dressed with the help of a shy maid who introduced herself as Annie, letting the girl fuss over her hair until it was arranged in an elegant style that would have done credit to any London ballroom. But when she descended to dinner, she found the dining room empty save for a single place setting at the massive table. His Grace sends his apologies, the butler, a dignified man called Graves, informed her. He has business in the village and will not return until late. He hoped you would not take offense. Rose stared at the solitary place setting, at the ridiculous expanse of polished wood stretching away into shadows, and felt the isolation crash over her anew. She had traded Thomas's obsessive attention for Alexander's distant courtesy, had exchanged the suffocating crowds of London for the empty moors of Northumberland. She had freed herself from one cage only to find another. The meal was excellent. Roasted pheasant and root vegetables, fresh bread and local cheese, but Rose could barely taste it. She ate mechanically, listening to the silence of the manor settling around her like snow. When she finally returned to her chambers, she found something unexpected on her sitting room table. A book, old and well-loved, its leather binding soft with handling, with a note tucked inside. The handwriting was Alexander's. She recognized it from the marriage documents. The message was brief. You asked about gardens. My mother kept extensive journals of her attempts. I thought you might find them amusing, or perhaps instructive if you wished to try where she failed. The library has more if these interest you. A. Rose opened the book and found detailed sketches of garden plans, notes on plantings and failures, observations written in a delicate feminine hand about the challenges of cultivating beauty in such harsh soil. But there was joy in those pages too. Delight in small victories, determination in the face of repeated setbacks. She traced the drawings with careful fingers, imagining the woman who had tried to bring life to this stark place. Alexander's mother, who had clearly loved her impossible garden despite its failures. And Alexander had thought to share this with her, had noticed her comment about the lack of gardens, and offered this small gesture of, what? Kindness? Understanding? Rose curled into one of the chairs by the fire, Alexander's mother's journal open in her lap, and read late into the night. Outside, the wind howled across the moors, wild and free. Inside, something that had felt like a cage began to feel, just perhaps, like the possibility of home. Rose woke to the sound of screaming. She bolted upright in the unfamiliar bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to orient herself. Moonlight streamed through the windows, painting the room in shades of silver and shadow. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in her father's house, that Thomas was breaking down her door. Then the scream came again, and she realized it was coming from the adjoining chambers. Alexander's rooms. She was out of bed before conscious thought caught up with instinct, her bare feet silent on the cold floor as she crossed to the connecting door. Her hand hesitated on the handle. He had given her the key, had promised her privacy and autonomy. Entering his chambers uninvited would violate the careful boundaries they had established. But that sound, raw and anguished, torn from somewhere deep and primal, overrode propriety. Rose turned the handle and stepped through. Alexander's bedroom was larger than hers, but far more austere. No softening fabrics or warm colors here. Just dark wood and stone, a massive bed that looked more like a monk's cot despite its size, and a dying fire that cast barely enough light to see by. Alexander was in the bed, tangled in sheets that twisted around him like shrouds, his body rigid with tension. "No," he gasped, still caught in whatever nightmare held him. "Please, God, no." Rose approached cautiously, the way one might approach a wounded animal. Up close, she could see the sheen of sweat on his skin, the way his scarred face contorted with anguish. His hands clutched at the sheets, and she noticed for the first time that his knuckles bore scars, too. Old wounds, long healed, that spoke of violence given or received. "Alexander." She kept her voice soft, unthreatening. "Alexander, wake up." He didn't respond, trapped deeper in his nightmare than her voice could reach. His breathing came in ragged gasps, and he turned his head violently, as if trying to escape something only he could see. Rose made a decision. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed her hand carefully on his shoulder. His skin was hot beneath the thin fabric of his nightshirt, and the muscle beneath was hard as stone. "Alexander," she said again, firmer this time. "You're safe. You're at Ravenscroft. Whatever you're seeing, it's not real." His eyes flew open. For a moment he stared at her without recognition, his pale eyes wild and unfocused. Rose held very still, acutely aware of his size and strength, of how quickly a man could move from nightmare to violence. She had learned that lesson well with Thomas. But Alexander was not Thomas. Recognition flooded back into his gaze, followed immediately by horror. He jerked away from her touch, pressing himself against the headboard as if she were the thing to be feared. "Rose." Her name came out hoarse, damaged. "What are you? You shouldn't be here." "You were screaming." He closed his eyes, and in the moonlight, she saw the tracks of tears on his face. "I apologize. I should have warned you that that the nights are not always peaceful." "What were you dreaming about?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter." He scrubbed at his face with trembling hands, and Rose noticed that his fingers were shaking. "Please, just go back to your room. Forget you saw this." "I can't very well forget it when the walls between our rooms are so thin." Rose settled herself more comfortably on the bed, a deliberate choice to stay, despite his clear discomfort. "Besides, we made a bargain, remember? We may keep our secrets during the day, but it seems night has other plans." Alexander laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "You want to know my nightmares? Very well. I dream of fire, of my fiancé's face as she died, of the child I couldn't save." He looked at her then, his expression naked with pain. "There. Are you satisfied? Or would you like more gruesome details?" Rose's breath caught. Fiancé. Child. The words hung in the air between them like accusations. "The scandal," she breathed. 5 years ago. This is what happened. This is what I caused." Alexander pushed himself out of bed, needing movement, needing distance. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the moonlit moors. Her name was Catherine, Lady Catherine Ashford, daughter of the Earl of Pembroke. Beautiful, accomplished, everything a duchess should be. We were to be married that June. Rose waited, giving him space to tell it in his own time. "She was with child," Alexander continued, his voice flat, emotionless. The tone of a man reciting facts to avoid feeling them. "Not mine. She had been having an affair with my best friend, Marcus, for months. I discovered them together at a house party. In my own family's hunting lodge, in fact. The irony was not lost on me." "What did you do?" "I confronted Marcus. There was a fight." He touched his scarred face absently. "He gave me this, actually. A broken bottle. I barely remember it happening. I was so angry, so hurt. The betrayal of it was worse than any physical wound." "That's understandable. Is it?" He turned to face her, and his expression was terrible. "Because my anger, my loss of control, had consequences. Marcus fled the scene, took one of the estate's horses and rode toward London in the middle of a storm. Catherine went after him. She was terrified I would kill him, you see. Terrified of what I might do in my rage." Rose felt ice forming in her stomach, could see where this story was leading. The bridge over the Blackwater was old, rotted. It should have been repaired years earlier, but I had been too busy with parliamentary matters to attend to estate maintenance. Alexander's hands clenched into fists. The horse balked. Catherine was thrown. The fall wouldn't have killed her. It was only 15 feet to the water. But she struck her head on the rocks. Alexander. They found her the next morning. She'd been dead for hours. The cold water, the injury, the shock, the physicians couldn't say which killed her first. But the child? His voice broke. The child died with her. An innocent life ended because of my temper. Rose stood and crossed to him, ignoring his defensive posture. It was an accident. An accident I caused. He laughed again, that awful bitter sound. Society was quick to agree. The Dark Duke, they called me. The monster who murdered his pregnant fiancé in a fit of jealous rage. Never mind that I never laid a hand on her. That she died fleeing her lover, not me. The narrative was too delicious to resist. That's why you left London. I was politely encouraged to depart. The Earl of Pembroke wanted blood, my blood. But even he couldn't challenge a duke directly. So instead, they whispered. They speculated. They turned me into a Gothic villain to frighten their children with. He looked at her, and his eyes were empty, and perhaps they were right to do so. Perhaps I am exactly the monster they think I am. You're not, Rose said it with conviction, thinking of the workshop, of the tenants he cared for, of the gentle way he had handled the old man. You made a mistake. You lost your temper in circumstances that would have broken most men. But you didn't kill Catherine, Alexander. Her choices killed her, and Marcus's choices, and simple, terrible luck. You're very certain of that, considering you've known me less than a week. I'm certain because I've seen what real monsters look like. Rose wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. Thomas seemed so perfect at first. Charming, attentive, everything a young woman could want in a husband. I thought myself lucky when he proposed. When did it change? The night I accepted. Rose's voice went distant, remembering. He kissed me, which was forward but not entirely inappropriate given our engagement. But when I tried to pull away, he wouldn't let me. He gripped my arms hard enough to leave bruises and told me I belonged to him now, that I would learn to be obedient. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her speak. I broke the engagement the next day. My father was furious. Thomas was wealthy, well-connected, exactly the sort of match we needed to restore our fortunes. But I couldn't marry a man who looked at me like I was property to be owned. She laughed shakily. Of course, that didn't stop Thomas. If anything, my rejection made him worse. He began appearing wherever I went, sending letters describing in detail what he would do to me once I was his wife, how he would correct my independent spirit. Did he hurt you? He tried. Once at a garden party, he cornered me in a gazebo, put his hands around my throat and told me he could kill me and no one would care because I was just a woman, just a thing to be possessed. Rose touched her neck unconsciously, remembering the pressure, the terror, the certainty that she was about to die. A gardener heard me struggling and intervened. Thomas claimed it was a lover's quarrel, and of course everyone believed him. That's when he started buying up your father's debts. Yes, Papa gambled away what little remained of our fortune. And Thomas bought every note, every obligation. He told me I could marry him willingly, or he would have my father thrown in debtor's prison and me declared his ward. Either way, he said, I would belong to him eventually. Her hands trembled, and she clasped them together to still them. So I ran. That night at Thornfield House, when he cornered me in the corridor, I knew it was my last chance. If he caught me, if he dragged me back to his townhouse, I would never escape. Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then he crossed to her and, moving with exquisite care, took her hands in his. He will never touch you again. I swear it on my life. You can't promise that. I can, and I do. His grip was gentle but unshakable. I may be a monster, Rose, but I am your monster now, and I protect what is mine. The possessiveness in those words should have frightened her, should have reminded her of Thomas's obsessive claims of ownership. But coming from Alexander, from this man who had given her keys to lock him out and promised her eventual freedom, it felt different. It felt safe. "We're quite a pair," she said, managing a tremulous smile. The Dark Duke and his desperate bride. Society would have a field day if they knew the truth. Society can go to hell. Alexander released her hands, but didn't step away. We have survived worse than their whispers, you and I. We will survive this too. Will we? Rose looked up at him, at his scarred face and haunted eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. Not love, it was far too soon for that, but recognition. The understanding that comes from shared wounds, from knowing what it means to be broken and still standing. Sometimes I wonder if survival is enough. What more would you want? Peace, perhaps? Or purpose? A reason to do more than simply endure. She gestured at the window, at the wild moors beyond. Your mother tried to build a garden in this wilderness. She failed, but she tried. That seems braver than mere survival. Alexander was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the moonlight. Then he said, "The morning after Catherine died, I stood on these battlements and considered jumping. It would have been easy. Quick, an end to the guilt and the whispers and the crushing weight of being me." Rose's breath caught. "I didn't jump," he continued. "Not because I was brave, but because I was stubborn. I refused to give society the satisfaction of confirming their worst assumptions about me. So I survived. Day after day, year after year, I simply endured." He touched her face, a feather-light brush of fingers against her cheek. "But perhaps you're right. Perhaps endurance is not enough." "What changed?" "You did." His smile was small but genuine. "When you burst through my door, all fire and desperation, I saw something I had thought lost. The possibility of connection, of purpose beyond my own misery." He dropped his hand, suddenly uncertain. "I know our arrangement is one of convenience. I know you may never feel more for me than obligation. But Rose, you have given me something I thought impossible, a reason to try." Rose felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I don't know if I can be what you need. I'm broken too, Alexander. Thomas broke something in me, and I don't know if it can be repaired." "Then we'll be broken together." He offered his hand, not as a duke to a duchess, but as one wounded soul to another. No more pretense, no more perfect performances. Just two people trying to build something real from the wreckage of what came before. She took his hand, felt the warmth of his palm against hers, the calluses and scars that marked a life lived rather than merely observed. "No more secrets?" "I won't promise that. Some wounds are too raw to expose to light." His grip tightened. "But honesty, where we can manage it. Truth, when the lies become too heavy to carry." I can agree to that." They stood together in the moonlight, hands clasped, two broken people in a fortress on the edge of nowhere. Outside, an owl called across the moors, its cry lonely and wild. Inside, something that had been frozen began slowly to thaw. "You should sleep," Alexander said eventually. "The nightmares are usually one-time occurrences. I won't disturb you again tonight." "I don't mind being disturbed." Rose surprised herself with the words. "If you need someone to talk to, or simply someone to sit with you until the darkness passes, I'm here." His expression softened into something that might have been wonder. "I've been alone for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like. To have someone care whether I lived or died." "Then let me remind you." She reached up and touched his scarred cheek, tracing the line of damage with gentle fingers. "You're not alone anymore, Alexander. Neither of us is." He leaned into her touch like a man starving for kindness, and Rose felt her heart crack open just a little. This was dangerous territory, caring for the man she had married out of convenience, feeling tenderness toward the monster society had painted him as. It complicated their arrangement, muddied the clean lines of their bargain. But standing here in the moonlight, with his scarred face cradled in her hand and his pain laid bare between them, Rose couldn't bring herself to regret it. "Stay," Alexander said softly. "Not for anything improper, just stay. I sleep better when I'm not alone." Rose nodded and let him lead her back to the bed. They lay down together on top of the covers, carefully not touching, but close enough to feel each other's warmth. Alexander's breathing gradually steadied, his body relaxing as sleep claimed him again. Rose watched the moonlight move across the ceiling and listened to the even rhythm of her husband's breath. She thought about gardens that refused to grow and people who refused to break. She thought about the difference between surviving and living, between endurance and hope. And somewhere in the quiet dark, surrounded by stone walls and wild moors, Rose Ravenscroft began to believe that perhaps, against all odds, they might find a way to do more than simply survive. Perhaps they might even learn to flourish. 3 weeks of peace. That was all they were granted. Rose had begun to settle into the rhythms of Ravenscroft Manor, finding unexpected comfort in its austere routines. She spent her mornings in the library, afternoons visiting Alexander's workshop or walking the moors, and evenings dining with her husband in companionable silence that had grown warmer with each passing day. The nightmares still came occasionally, for both of them, but they had fallen into the habit of seeking each other out in the darkness, talking until dawn, or simply sitting together until the demons retreated. She had even begun sketching plans for a garden, inspired by Alexander's mother's journals. Nothing ambitious, just a small walled space on the southern side of the manor where the stone might provide shelter from the harsh northern winds. Alexander had listened to her ideas with an attention that made her pulse quicken, and had promised to have the groundskeeper begin preparing the soil come spring. It felt dangerously close to happiness. Then the writer came. Rose was in the conservatory, a glass-roofed room that Alexander's mother had built for her failed horticultural experiments. When she heard the commotion in the courtyard, she looked up from the seed catalog she'd been studying to see a mud-splattered horse being led away by a groom, and a man in travel-stained clothes speaking urgently with Graves. Something cold settled in her stomach. She found Alexander in his study, the writer's message spread across his desk. His face was carved from granite, his pale eyes blazing with an anger she had only glimpsed before. When he looked up at her entrance, she saw murder in his expression. "What's happened?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Thomas Reed has been busy. Alexander's voice was deadly calm, which was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. It seems settling your father's debts was not sufficient to satisfy his obsession. He pushed the letter toward her. Rose picked it up with trembling fingers and read the cramped, urgent handwriting, a report from Alexander's London solicitor. Thomas had been quietly purchasing obligations throughout London for the past 3 weeks. Not gambling debts this time, but business ventures, property mortgages, commercial loans. He had bought up half the shipping concerns in the Thames, several banking interests, and a disturbing number of promissory notes from various members of Parliament. And he was calling them all due, simultaneously. "I don't understand," Rose said, though the cold dread in her stomach suggested she understood perfectly. "What does this have to do with us?" "Everything." Alexander stood and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back with military precision. "Reed is engineering a financial crisis. If all these debts come due at once, it will create a panic in the markets. Banks will fail. Businesses will collapse. The economic damage will be catastrophic." "But why?" "Because he knows I sit on the banking committee in Parliament. He knows I have the authority to intervene, to extend payment deadlines or arrange emergency loans." Alexander turned to face her, and his expression was bleak. "And he's made it clear that he will trigger this collapse unless I deliver you to him." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Rose sank into a chair, the letter crumpling in her nerveless fingers. "He would destroy the entire economy just to possess me?" Obsession is rarely rational. Alexander crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a measure of brandy with hands that shook slightly. "Your solicitor's report includes a personal message from Reed. Shall I read it, or have you heard enough?" "Read it." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he picked up a second sheet of paper and began to read in a flat, emotionless tone. "Your Grace, I trust you are enjoying my wife's company. I use the term wife loosely, of course, as we both know your marriage is nothing but a legal fiction designed to steal what belongs to me. Rose Everly was mine from the moment I first saw her, and she will be mine again. Your title and your money cannot change that fundamental truth." He paused, and Rose could see the effort it took him to continue. "I am prepared to be reasonable. Return Rose to me, unharmed and intact, and I will forgive this unfortunate incident. The debts will be restructured, the crisis averted, and we can all return to our proper places in society. Refuse, and I will burn London's economy to the ground and make certain everyone knows it was your fault. The dark duke who murdered his pregnant fiancée will be remembered as the man who destroyed England's prosperity to keep his stolen bride. I await your response. Thomas Reed." Silence filled the study like poison gas. Rose felt the world tilting beneath her, all the fragile peace she had built crashing down around her ears. She had known Thomas was obsessed, had understood he was dangerous. But this was madness on a scale she hadn't imagined possible. "You have to give me back to him," she heard herself say. "Absolutely not." Alexander's response was immediate and absolute. "You don't have a choice. If what he's threatening is true, if he really can cause that kind of damage, then I will find another way to stop him." Alexander set down the letter with careful precision, as if afraid he might tear it to shreds otherwise. "I will not hand you over to that monster, Rose. Not for all the banks in England. It's not just banks. It's people's livelihoods, their savings, their futures." Rose stood, wrapping her arms around herself to stop the shaking. How many families will be ruined if this crisis happens? How many people will lose everything because I was too selfish to... "Stop!" Alexander crossed to her in 2 strides and gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me very carefully. What Thomas Reed is doing is called extortion, and it is a crime. You are not responsible for his actions, no matter how he tries to twist the narrative. But I'm the cause. You are the excuse. There's a difference. His grip gentled, but remained firm. If it wasn't you, Reed would find some other lever to pull, some other way to feed his need for power and control. Men like him always do. Rose wanted to believe him, but the weight of potential catastrophe pressed down on her lungs. What are we going to do? We? Alexander's expression softened fractionally. You're asking what we will do, not what I should do with you? We're in this together, aren't we? That's what you said. We're broken together, building something from the wreckage. She managed a tremulous smile. I'm not going to abandon you to fight my battles alone. Something fierce and bright flared in Alexander's eyes. He pulled her into an embrace that was fierce and protective, and Rose let herself lean into his strength, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and safety. We fight, he said quietly against her hair. We find a way to break his power without giving him what he wants. How? I don't know yet. He pulled back enough to look at her face. But I have resources, Rose. Information networks, political allies, financial instruments that Reed can't possibly anticipate. He may have engineered this crisis, but he's also exposed himself in doing so. Extortion of a peer of the realm is a hanging offense. You'd see him executed? Without hesitation. The coldness in Alexander's voice sent shivers down her spine. He threatened you. Threatened our peace. Threatened to use innocent people as pawns in his sick game. Yes, Rose, I would watch him hang and sleep soundly afterward. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Blackwood entered, her expression grave. Your Grace, there's another rider, from London. He says the matter is urgent. Alexander and Rose exchanged glances. Send him in. The man who entered was clearly exhausted, his clothes covered in road dust and his face haggard. He bowed quickly to Alexander. Your Grace, I bring word from Lord Hartwick. He says to tell you that Reed has made his first move. The Bank of Threadneedle collapsed this morning. There's panic in the exchange. Rose felt the blood drain from her face. It had already begun. Alexander's expression remained calm, but she could see the fury simmering beneath his control. How bad? Bad enough that Parliament is being recalled for an emergency session. They're demanding your presence, Your Grace. The Prime Minister himself has requested you return to London immediately to help stabilize the situation. Of course he has. Alexander's laugh was bitter. Tell Lord Hartwick I will depart within the hour. And send word to my solicitors. I want every piece of information they can find about Thomas Reed's financial dealings. Every debt, every investment, every questionable transaction. Someone that aggressive has made mistakes. We will find them. The messenger bowed and departed, leaving Alexander and Rose alone once more. You're going to London, Rose said. It wasn't a question. I have to. If I don't, Reed will use my absence as proof that I care more about keeping you than about England's welfare. The narrative will destroy any chance we have of fighting him legally. Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. But I won't leave you unprotected. Mrs. Blackwood and the household staff are loyal, and I'll leave armed guards. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. London is exactly where Reed wants you. It's too dangerous. Everywhere is dangerous as long as Thomas is free. Rose straightened her spine, calling up the steel that had seen her through the worst of her father's decline and Thomas's persecution. You said we were in this together. You said we would fight. I can't fight from Ravenscroft while you face him alone. Rose, he's obsessed with possessing me, Alexander. That means I'm the one weapon we have that he can't plan for. His entire strategy depends on you being willing to sacrifice anything to keep me safe. What if we turn that against him? Alexander stared at her, and she could see his mind working, calculating possibilities and risks. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we give him what he thinks he wants. Let him believe he's won, that you're willing to negotiate my return. Draw him out into the open, where his crimes can be witnessed and documented. Rose's hands clenched into fists. Thomas is arrogant. He believes he's untouchable because he's always been able to manipulate the system. But he's never faced someone with your resources and your willingness to destroy him. You want to use yourself as bait. I want to end this. Not just for us, but for every woman who might cross his path in the future. If we let him win now, he'll know he can use this tactic again. He'll find another victim, ruin another life. Rose moved closer to Alexander, willing him to understand. I spent months being afraid of him. I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to strike again. Alexander was silent for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he cupped her cheek in his palm, his touch gentle despite the violence simmering in his eyes. You are the bravest person I have ever met, he said softly, and also possibly the most reckless. I learned from the best. She covered his hand with her own. Will you let me fight beside you? I don't think I could stop you if I tried. He leaned his forehead against hers, a gesture of intimacy that sent warmth flooding through her chest. But we do this carefully, methodically. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We gather evidence, build a legal case, and destroy Thomas Reed using the very system he thinks he's mastered. And if the legal route doesn't work? Alexander's smile was dark and dangerous. Then we'll resort to less civilized methods. I may have left London society, but I never left behind my connections to people who operate outside its boundaries. Reed thinks he's the only one willing to play dirty. He's about to discover how wrong he is. A thrill of something that might have been fear or excitement ran down Rose's spine. This was the man society had called a monster, calculating, ruthless, willing to do whatever was necessary to protect what was his. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. When do we leave? She asked. Within the hour. Pack light, we'll travel fast and arrive before Reed expects us. The element of surprise is one of the few advantages we have. Alexander pulled away reluctantly, already shifting into the role of strategist and commander. I'll send word ahead to have the London house prepared and to summon my contacts. We'll need allies in Parliament, witnesses to Reed's extortion, and preferably a magistrate willing to move quickly once we have sufficient evidence. Rose nodded and turned to go, but Alexander caught her wrist, pulling her back. Rose, he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. If at any point this becomes too dangerous, if Reed gets closer than I can tolerate, I want your word that you'll run. Mrs. Blackwood has instructions to take you to my estate in Scotland if necessary. It's even more remote than Ravenscroft, and Reed would never find you there. I'm not running. Your word, Rose. His grip tightened. I can face Reed's financial manipulations and his threats to my reputation. What I cannot face is the thought of him putting his hands on you. Promise me you'll run if it comes to that." She saw the fear beneath his determination, the nightmare of Catherine's death still haunting him. He had already lost one woman to his own actions, however indirectly. The thought of losing another was unbearable to him. "I promise," she said softly, "but only if you promise the same. If this goes badly, if Reed finds a way to destroy you, you have to let me go. Don't sacrifice yourself trying to save me." "That's not a promise I can make." "Then we're at an impasse." Rose managed to smile despite the fear curling in her stomach. "I suppose we'll just have to make sure we both survive." Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that eased some of the tension crackling between them. "You drive a hard bargain, Duchess." "I learned that from you too." They prepared for departure in a flurry of organized chaos. Rose packed the essentials while Annie fluttered around, trying to include every gown and accessory. Alexander met with Mrs. Blackwood and the estate managers, leaving detailed instructions and contingency plans. Horses were readied, guards assembled, weapons checked and loaded. As Rose descended the main stairs, her traveling cloak fastened and her resolve firm, she caught sight of Alexander waiting in the entrance hall. He was dressed for travel in dark, practical clothing, but he wore his authority like armor. This was the Duke of Ravenscroft in full command, and she understood suddenly why society had feared him. He was magnificent. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. "Ready?" she confirmed, taking it. They stepped out into the courtyard where their carriage waited, black and imposing, with armed outriders already mounted. The sky above Ravenscroft was heavy with clouds, and the wind carried the scent of approaching rain. Rose looked back at the fortress that had become her sanctuary, at the moors stretching wild and free beyond its walls. 3 weeks ago, she had felt like a prisoner here. Now, leaving felt like abandoning safety for the storm. But sometimes, she thought as Alexander helped her into the carriage, the only way through the storm was directly into its heart. "To London," Alexander told the driver, "and don't spare the horses." The carriage lurched into motion, carrying them south toward the city, toward Thomas Reed's trap, toward a confrontation that would determine not just their future, but the fate of countless others caught in the web of one man's obsession. Rose settled into her seat and met Alexander's eyes across the confined space. In them, she saw determination, fury, and something else. Something that looked dangerously like devotion. "Whatever happens," she said, "we face it together." "Together," Alexander agreed, and took her hand in his. The carriage rolled on through the gathering dusk, carrying them toward London and the reckoning that awaited. The journey to London took 3 days of relentless travel, stopping only to change horses and snatch a few hours of fitful sleep at coaching inns along the way. Alexander spent most of the journey reviewing documents his network of informants had sent ahead. Detailed accounts of Thomas Reed's financial manipulations, witness statements from creditors he had strong-armed, and a disturbing collection of letters he had written to various women over the years. "He's done this before," Alexander said grimly on the second day, passing Rose a bundle of correspondence. "Not on this scale, but the pattern is identical. He fixates on a woman, pursues her relentlessly, and when she refuses him, he finds ways to destroy her reputation or her family's standing." Rose read through the letters with growing horror. 3 different women, all from respectable families, all driven to desperate measures to escape Thomas's attention. One had fled to the continent. Another had married a man 40 years her senior to gain his protection. The third had simply disappeared from society entirely, and no one seemed to know what had become of her. "Why has no one stopped him?" she asked, her voice tight with anger. "Because he's careful. He never leaves evidence that could be used in court, and his victims are always too frightened or too ashamed to speak publicly." Alexander's expression was carved from ice. "But he made a mistake this time. He went after you, and in doing so, he went after me. I don't have the same limitations as a terrified young woman with no resources." They arrived in London just after dawn on the third day, the city emerging from morning mist like something from a fever dream. The streets were already crowded despite the early hour, crowds gathering outside the Bank of England, newsboys shouting headlines about the financial crisis, and an atmosphere of barely controlled panic that made Rose's skin prickle. Alexander's London townhouse was a haven of quiet efficiency in the midst of the chaos. Servants moved with practiced silence, and within minutes of their arrival, Rose found herself in a drawing room with tea and a bath being prepared upstairs. "Rest," Alexander said, though he looked like he hadn't slept in days himself. "I need to go to Parliament and assess the damage. I'll have guards posted at every entrance, and you're not to leave the house for any reason. Understood? I'm not a child to be ordered about. No, you're my wife, and you're the target of a dangerous man's obsession." His tone softened. "Please, Rose, give me this peace of mind. I can't fight Reed effectively if I'm constantly worried about your safety." She relented, recognizing the fear beneath his commanding tone. "Go. Do what you need to do. I'll be here when you return." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become habitual over the past weeks, and departed in a swirl of dark coat and grim determination. Rose spent the day in restless anxiety, pacing the drawing room and trying to distract herself with books that couldn't hold her attention. Mrs. Hartwell, the London housekeeper, brought her meals she couldn't eat and newspapers she read with mounting dread. The financial crisis was worse than she'd imagined. The Bank of Threadneedle's collapse had triggered a cascade of failures, and fortunes built over generations were evaporating like morning dew. All because of her. No, she reminded herself firmly. Because of Thomas. Because of his obsession and his willingness to hurt innocents to satisfy his need for control. But the guilt still gnawed at her. Alexander returned well after dark, his face haggard and his shoulders tight with tension. He found Rose in the library, curled in a chair by the fire with one of his mother's garden journals open but unread in her lap. "How bad?" she asked without preamble. "Catastrophic." He poured himself a brandy and drank it in one swallow. 7 banks have failed. Parliament is in an uproar. The Prime Minister is demanding action, and the opposition is using the crisis to call for investigations into everyone's financial dealings. It's complete chaos. And Thomas? Sitting in the gallery watching the proceedings with a smile on his face. Alexander's hands clenched around the empty glass. He knows exactly what he's doing. Every time someone proposes a solution, he finds a way to block it through one of his purchased proxies. He's enjoying this. The power, the destruction, the knowledge that he's holding the entire economy hostage. Rose set aside the journal and went to him. "Did you find anything we can use against him?" "Possibly." Alexander set down the glass and pulled a letter from his coat. One of Reed's former business partners is willing to testify that Reed forged documents to acquire some of the debts he's now calling due. It's not much, but it might be enough to bring charges of fraud. Might be. Reed has friends in the magistracy. Getting a warrant issued will be difficult, and even if we succeed, he'll have time to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. Alexander's frustration was palpable. "We need something more damning." Something so public and undeniable that even his connections can't protect him. Then we give it to him. Rose took a breath, steeling herself. You said he was watching from the gallery today. He wants to see you squirm, wants to savor his victory. What if we arrange a meeting? Tell him you're willing to negotiate. Absolutely not. I told you. You told me we would do this carefully and methodically. This is both. Rose gripped his arms, forcing him to focus on her rather than his anger. Think about it, Alexander. If we can get him to openly threaten me in front of witnesses, if we can make him explicitly connect his financial manipulations to his demand for my return, we'll have evidence that can't be disputed. It's too dangerous. If something goes wrong, then you'll be there to stop it. She softened her tone, trying to reach past his protective instincts to his strategic mind. You've spent 3 days gathering evidence and building legal cases. How much longer will that take? How many more banks will fail while we're being careful? Thomas is counting on you being paralyzed by the need to protect me. Let's use that against him. Alexander pulled away from her, pacing to the window where he stood staring out at the darkened street. Rose waited, letting him work through the calculations, the risks, the possibilities. She was learning to read him, the way his shoulders tensed when he was afraid, the slight tightening of his jaw when he was considering something he didn't want to accept. If we do this, he said finally, still not looking at her, it will be on my terms. In a location I control, with people I trust positioned to intervene if he tries anything. And at the first sign that he's going to hurt you, we abort. No arguments. Agreed. He turned to face her, and his expression was anguished. I can't lose you, Rose. I know that wasn't part of our bargain. I know we agreed this was temporary. But the truth is, he stopped, seeming to struggle with words. The truth is that somewhere between Ravenscroft's battlements and your mad plan to use yourself as bait, I fell in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and inevitable all at once. Rose felt her heart stutter in her chest. Alexander, I don't expect you to return the feeling. I know I'm not what you would have chosen for yourself, a scarred recluse with a violent past and enough nightmares to populate a Gothic novel. But you should know, before we walk into whatever trap Reed has prepared, that I would burn the world to keep you safe. That's not the arrangement we made, I realize. It's not what you signed on for, but it's the truth. Rose crossed to him, her mind reeling. She had known their relationship was changing, had felt the shift from convenient arrangement to genuine partnership. But love? That was supposed to be impossible. She had married him to escape Thomas, had agreed to play the devoted wife for a year or two before seeking her freedom. Except that somewhere along the way, the performance had become real. She thought of his gentleness with his tenants, the way he had held her through her nightmares without asking for anything in return. She thought of garden journals left on her table, and the fierce protectiveness in his eyes when he spoke of her safety. She thought of late-night conversations where they had peeled back their armor and shown each other the wounds beneath. You're right, she said softly, reaching up to touch his scarred face. You're not what I would have chosen. She saw him flinch, saw him start to pull away, and tightened her grip. I would have chosen someone safe. Someone who wouldn't challenge me or see past the mask I wore for society. Someone I could keep at a comfortable distance. She traced the line of his scar from temple to jaw, the way she had learned he found comforting. But Alexander, I don't want safe anymore. I don't want comfortable or distant or any of the things I thought I needed. Rose, I love you. The words came out fierce, certain, undeniable. I love your scars and your nightmares and the way you pretend to be a monster while secretly caring for everyone around you. I love that you gave me keys to lock you out and promised me freedom while hoping I would choose to stay. I love, her voice broke. I love that you see me as a person rather than a prize to be won. Alexander's hands came up to frame her face, his touch reverent and trembling. Say it again. I love you. Again. I love you, Alexander Ravenscroft. I love you, and I'm terrified of what that means, and I wouldn't change it for anything. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the chaste touches they had exchanged before. This was desperate and hungry. 5 weeks of carefully maintained distance burning away in an instant. Rose gasped against his mouth, and he swallowed the sound, one hand tangling in her hair, while the other pulled her impossibly closer. She had been kissed before, by Thomas, in those early days when she had still believed his charm was genuine. But Thomas's kisses had been about ownership, about marking territory and asserting dominance. Alexander kissed her like she was precious, like she was choosing to be there, and that choice was a gift he would never take for granted. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. I was prepared to let you go, he said roughly. When our arrangement ended, I was prepared to give you the freedom I promised and watch you walk away, even though it would have destroyed me. You won't have to. Rose threaded her fingers through his hair, anchoring him to her. I'm not going anywhere. Not after a year, not after 2. This is real, Alexander. We're real. We're also still facing a madman who wants to destroy us both. Then we destroy him first. Rose pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Together, as partners, as she hesitated over the word, then committed to it fully. As husband and wife, real ones, not the convenient fiction we started with. Something fierce and joyful flared in Alexander's expression. I love you, he said again, like he was testing the words, learning their shape. God help me, Rose. I love you so much it terrifies me. Good, she smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes. Fear means you have something to lose, something worth fighting for. He kissed her again, softer this time, with a tenderness that made her chest ache. We should go upstairs, he murmured against her lips. If we're going to face Reed tomorrow, we should rest. I don't want to rest. Rose traced the line of his jaw, feeling bold and reckless and more alive than she had ever felt. We've been so careful, Alexander. Separate chambers and locked doors and all the proper distance we thought we needed. But I don't want distance anymore. She saw understanding dawn in his eyes, saw heat follow it. Rose, are you certain? We agreed to many things when we were strangers making a desperate bargain. But we're not strangers anymore. She took his hand and placed it over her racing heart. I'm certain. I want this. I want you. If tomorrow everything falls apart, if Reed finds a way to destroy us, I want to know what it feels like to truly be your wife. Tomorrow won't destroy us. Alexander's voice was fierce with conviction. I won't allow it. But Rose... His expression softened. I've wanted this. Wanted you since the moment you burst through my door with fire in your eyes. But only if you're truly sure. There's no going back from this. I don't want to go back. I want to go forward. She rose on her toes and kissed him with all the love and fear and desperate hope churning in her chest. Take me upstairs, Alexander. Make me your wife in truth." He swept her into his arms, literally lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her toward the stairs. Rose laughed against his neck, giddy and terrified and absolutely certain this was right. They navigated the hallway with shared urgency, Alexander kicking his bedroom door closed behind them with a finality that sent shivers down Rose's spine. He set her down gently, his hands immediately going to the buttons of her dress. "If you want to stop," he said, his voice rough with desire and restraint, "at any point, just say so. I need you to know you're safe with me. Always safe." "I know." Rose covered his hands with hers, helping him with the stubborn fastenings. "I've never felt safer than I do with you." Their clothes fell away in a tangle of fabric and fumbling fingers, urgency tempered by tenderness. Alexander traced every inch of skin he exposed, as if memorizing her, and Rose found herself doing the same, learning the landscape of scars on his body, the stories written in old wounds and new muscle. When they finally came together, it was with a gentleness that stole her breath. Alexander moved with exquisite care, watching her face for any sign of discomfort, murmuring endearments against her skin. Rose had expected awkwardness. They were both so damaged, so armored against the world. But instead, there was only rightness. This was what it meant to be chosen, she realized. Not possessed or owned, but truly chosen. To have someone see all of you, the scars and the strength, the fear and the fire, and love you not despite those things, but because of them. "I love you," she whispered as they moved together, finding a rhythm that was uniquely theirs. "I love you. I love you." Alexander captured her mouth, swallowing her words and giving them back, transformed. They built towards something incandescent together, and when they finally tumbled over that edge, it was hand in hand, neither one alone. Afterwards, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled of sandalwood and safety. Rose's head pillowed on Alexander's scarred chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "No annulment," he said softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "No eventual freedom. I'm keeping you, Rose Ravenscroft, if you'll let me." "I'm keeping you too." She pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "We're quite selfish that way." He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Society will be so disappointed. They were hoping for a dramatic dissolution, I'm sure." "Society can go hang." Rose propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "We'll give them something better to talk about. A love story instead of a scandal. The Dark Duke and his brave Duchess defying the odds. We haven't defied them yet. Reed is still out there, still dangerous. But we'll face him together." Rose touched his face, tracing the familiar scar. "And when we win, because we will win, Alexander, we'll come back here and start planning that garden for real. Your mother would have liked that, I think. She would have loved you." Alexander caught her hand and kissed her palm. "My fierce, brave, impossible wife." "Your real wife," Rose corrected. "In every way that matters." "In every way that matters," he agreed. They lay together as the fire burned low and London slept uneasily beyond the windows. Two people who had been broken separately learning what it meant to be whole together. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and danger. But tonight was theirs alone. And for the first time since her desperate flight through Thornfield House's corridors, Rose felt something she had thought lost forever. Hope. The meeting was arranged for noon at the Ravenscroft townhouse. in the formal drawing room where witnesses could be positioned discreetly and escape routes secured. Alexander had spent the morning ensuring every detail was perfect. Magistrates hidden in adjacent rooms, court reporters positioned to document every word, and his most trusted men stationed at strategic points throughout the house. Rose dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue that brought out the steel in her eyes, her hair arranged in a style that was both elegant and severe. She looked every inch a duchess, armored in silk and sapphires, her wedding ring heavy on her finger. "You don't have to do this," Alexander said for the 10th time as they waited in his study for Thomas's arrival. "We can still find another way. We've been through this." Rose adjusted his cravat, a wifely gesture that still made his breath catch. "This is the fastest way to end it. The cleanest way. There's nothing clean about putting you in the same room as that monster." She kissed him softly, a promise and a reassurance. "I have my own monster to protect me. A far better one than Thomas could ever aspire to be." A knock at the door interrupted them. Graves entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, Mr. Reed has arrived. He's brought company." Alexander's jaw tightened. "How many?" "A magistrate, sir, and what appears to be a constable. They're demanding entry under legal authority." Rose felt ice settle in her stomach. This wasn't the private negotiation they had planned. Thomas had brought the law itself to their door. "It's a power play," Alexander said grimly. "He's trying to force our hand. Make it look like we're the ones breaking the law by keeping you here." He turned to Graves. "Show them to the drawing room, and make sure our witnesses are ready." They descended the stairs together, Rose's hand tucked into the crook of Alexander's arm. She could feel the tension radiating from him, barely contained fury wrapped in aristocratic composure. As they approached the drawing room, she heard Thomas's voice, smooth, confident. The voice of a man who believed he had already won. Extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures. I'm sure once the Duke understands the legal ramifications of harboring another man's intended wife. Alexander pushed open the door, and the conversation died. Thomas stood in the center of the room, dressed impeccably in gray morning wear, his handsome face arranged in an expression of concerned righteousness. Beside him stood a portly magistrate, Rose, recognized as Sir Edmund Crawley, a man known for his conservative views and his susceptibility to bribes. A nervous-looking constable hovered near the door, clearly uncomfortable with whatever he'd been dragged into. "Reed," Alexander said coldly, "I don't recall inviting you to my home." "Your Grace." Thomas executed a bow that managed to be both correct and mocking. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I'm afraid circumstances have forced my hand. You see, I've become aware that you're holding Miss Everly against her will." "The Duchess of Ravenscroft," Alexander interrupted. "My wife. And I can assure you, she's here entirely of her own volition." Thomas's smile didn't waver. "Ah, yes. The hasty marriage. Conducted with such unseemly speed that one has to wonder about the lady's state of mind when she consented. Sir Edmund has agreed to investigate the matter, haven't you, Sir Edmund?" The magistrate cleared his throat. "Indeed. Mr. Reed has presented compelling evidence that the marriage may have been contracted under duress. If that's the case, it could be annulled. And Miss Everly—" "Duchess," Rose said sharply, stepping forward. "I am the Duchess of Ravenscroft, Sir Edmund, and I entered my marriage freely and gladly. Whatever evidence Mr. Reed has presented is fabricated." Thomas's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Rose, my dear, you don't have to pretend anymore. I know he threatened you, used your father's debts to coerce you. But you're safe now. I've brought the authorities to protect you." "Protect me?" Rose laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut. "From what, exactly? A husband who treats me with respect and kindness? Or perhaps you mean to protect me from the freedom to make my own choices? Your choices were influenced by fear and manipulation." Thomas took a step toward her, and Alexander immediately moved to intercept, placing himself between them. Thomas ignored him, speaking directly to Rose. "I have documented evidence of the Duke's violent past, his responsibility for his previous fiancé's death, the rumors of his unstable temperament. What woman in her right mind would choose such a man? A woman who recognizes the difference between true danger and society's gossip," Rose replied. "But you wouldn't understand that, would you, Thomas? You've spent so long manipulating narratives to your advantage that you've forgotten what truth looks like." A flicker of anger crossed Thomas's face before he smoothed it away. "Sir Edmund, if you would be so kind as to interview the Duchess privately, I'm certain she'll reveal the duress she's been under." "There will be no private interviews," Alexander said flatly. "My wife has stated her position clearly. If you have actual evidence of wrongdoing, present it. Otherwise, remove yourself from my property." "I'm afraid I can't do that." Thomas pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat. "I have here legal documentation establishing my prior claim to Miss Everleigh's hand. Her father signed a betrothal contract before his relocation to Bath, a contract that predates your marriage and takes precedence under law." Rose felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. I broke our engagement months ago." "You attempted to break it. But a woman cannot unilaterally dissolve a legally binding contract without her father's consent. And your father, bless him, saw reason when I explained the situation." Thomas's smile was poisonous. "The contract is ironclad, Rose, which means your marriage to Ravenscroft is bigamous, null and void." Sir Edmund examined the papers with obvious discomfort. "This does appear to be legitimate, Your Grace. If the prior contract was properly executed, it wasn't." The voice came from the doorway, where a gray-haired solicitor Rose didn't recognize had appeared. "Forgive the interruption, Sir Edmund, but I am Mr. Pemberton, legal counsel to the Everleigh family, and I can assure you that no such contract exists." Thomas's composure finally cracked. "That's a lie. James Everleigh signed. He signed nothing." Pemberton moved into the room, carrying his own set of documents. "Mr. Everleigh has been my client for 20 years, Mr. Reed. Every legal document bearing his signature crosses my desk. I have no record of any betrothal contract between his daughter and yourself." "Then he executed it privately." "Impossible. A betrothal contract requires witnesses and legal registration to be valid. What you have there," Pemberton gestured to Thomas's papers, "is most likely a forgery. A rather good one, I'll admit, but a forgery nonetheless." The room erupted. Sir Edmund demanded to see both sets of documents. The constable looked increasingly alarmed, and Thomas's mask finally shattered completely, revealing the obsession and rage beneath. "This is ridiculous!" He turned on Rose, all pretense of civilized concern gone. "You belong to me. I've invested months in securing you, spent a fortune buying up your father's debts, engineered an entire financial crisis to force Ravenscroft's hand. And there we have it." Alexander's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Confession of extortion, conspiracy, and fraud, all witnessed by a magistrate and a constable. Graves, you may bring in the court reporters now." The door to the adjacent room opened, revealing 3 men with notebooks who had apparently recorded every word. Thomas stared at them, comprehension dawning slowly across his face. "You set a trap," he breathed. "I matched your strategy," Alexander corrected. "You wanted a public confrontation? I provided one, with official witnesses to document your crimes. You threatened to use the law against me? I brought the law into my home to hear your confession directly from your lips." Thomas lunged at Rose so quickly that even Alexander, prepared as he was, barely had time to react. But Rose had learned in the months of Thomas's persecution to recognize the signs of his violence. She was already moving, stepping aside as Alexander caught Thomas by the throat and slammed him against the wall with enough force to rattle the paintings. "You will never," Alexander said with deadly quiet, "touch my wife again." "Your Grace," Sir Edmund sputtered. "This is assault. This is defense of my household against an intruder who just confessed to extortion and attempted to forge legal documents." Alexander didn't release his grip on Thomas's throat. "Constable, I suggest you do your duty and place this man under arrest before I forget my civilized veneer entirely." The constable, looking relieved to have clear instructions, moved forward with his manacles. Thomas struggled, his face flushing with rage and oxygen deprivation. "You can't do this," he gasped. "I'll ruin you. I'll call in every debt, crash every bank, destroy the entire economy if I have to. You'll do nothing." Rose spoke quietly, but with absolute certainty. "Because you no longer have that power. While you were arranging this little theatrical performance, my husband's associates were seizing your assets under suspicion of fraud. Every debt you purchased, every banking interest you control, it's all been frozen pending investigation." Thomas's eyes widened. "That's not possible. I had safeguards." "You had accomplices," Alexander corrected, finally releasing him to the constable's custody. "And when faced with charges of conspiracy versus cooperation with the Crown, they proved remarkably willing to provide evidence against you. We have documentation of every forged document, every bribed official, every illegal manipulation of the markets." He smiled his terrible smile. "You wanted to play games with the law, Reed. You just discovered you're not very good at it." "Sir Edmund," the constable said nervously, "given the evidence and the confession I've witnessed, I believe I should escort Mr. Reed to the magistrate's court for formal charges." Sir Edmund looked between Thomas's rage-twisted face and Alexander's cold satisfaction, clearly calculating which side would benefit his career more. "Indeed," he said finally. "Most irregular situation. Mr. Reed, I'm afraid you'll need to answer some rather serious questions." "This isn't over," Thomas snarled as the constable began leading him toward the door. "I'll find a way, Rose. You're mine. Do you hear me? Mine. You'll never be free of me." Alexander moved to block his view of Rose, his posture protective and absolutely final. "She was never yours, Reed. She chose me. Not because of contracts or debts or manipulation, but because I gave her what you never could, the freedom to choose." "She doesn't love you," Thomas spat. "How could she? You're a monster, a killer, and yet she loves me anyway." Alexander's voice softened. "That's the difference between us, Reed. You wanted to own her. I wanted her to be free, and in her freedom, she chose to stay." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but the constable had finally managed to drag him into the hallway. His shouts echoed back through the house, gradually fading as he was removed from the premises entirely. Silence fell over the drawing room. Sir Edmund cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, this has been most enlightening. I'll need statements from everyone present for the official record. Your Grace, if you and the Duchess could make yourselves available." "Tomorrow," Alexander said firmly. My wife has endured quite enough for one day. After Sir Edmund and the others had departed, promising to return in the morning, Rose and Alexander stood alone in the drawing room. Rose was trembling, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation finally draining away. It's over, she whispered. It's actually over. Almost. Alexander took her hands in his. There's one more thing I need to do. Before she could ask what he meant, he dropped to one knee before her. Rose's breath caught. Alexander, what? I asked you to marry me once out of convenience and desperation. I offered you a bargain, an arrangement, a temporary solution to both our problems. His pale eyes held hers, intense and unwavering. But Rose, I'm asking you again now. Not as a duke seeking social rehabilitation, but as a man who loves you beyond reason or wisdom. Will you marry me? Not in law, that's already done, but in truth, in your heart. Will you choose me, freely and without coercion, knowing all my flaws and scars and the darkness I carry? Tears spilled down Rose's cheeks. You already know my answer. Say it anyway. I need to hear it without duress or danger or any shadow of obligation. Rose dropped to her knees before him, bringing them face to face, equal and chosen. Yes, Alexander Ravenscroft. I will marry you in truth. I will choose you every day for the rest of my life. I will love your scars and your strength, your darkness and your light. I will stand beside you, not because any contract demands it, but because there is nowhere else I would rather be. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, pouring 5 years of loneliness and 3 weeks of desperate love into the touch. When they finally broke apart, both were crying, both were laughing. Both were whole in a way neither had been alone. I love you, he whispered against her lips. My brave, brilliant, impossible Duchess. I love you, she answered. My dark, devoted, wonderful Duke. They rose together and walked to the window, looking out over London, where the financial crisis was already beginning to stabilize now that Thomas's manipulations had been exposed. The city would recover, as it always did. The banks would rebuild. Life would continue. And in Ravenscroft Manor's southern courtyard, come spring, a garden would begin to grow in soil that had defeated every previous attempt. Not because the conditions had changed, but because two people who had learned to flourish in harsh circumstances would tend it together. What happens now? Rose asked, leaning into Alexander's embrace. Now we live, he said simply. We return to Ravenscroft. We plant your garden. We build a life that's ours alone. And perhaps... He turned her to face him, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. Perhaps we reconsider our stance on heirs. If you wanted. If you were willing to risk bringing a child into this world with me. Rose's hand went to her stomach, where new life might already be growing from their night of passion. I think, she said softly, that any child raised by the Dark Duke and his Duchess would be extraordinary, fierce and kind, and absolutely unstoppable. Like their mother. Like both their parents. They stood together as afternoon light gilded the London rooftops. Two broken people who had found in each other not healing. Some wounds ran too deep for that. But acceptance. The understanding that scars didn't make you less, that darkness could coexist with love, that sometimes the greatest strength came from admitting you needed someone else. Thomas Reed would face trial for his crimes. Society would gossip and speculate. The financial markets would eventually stabilize. But none of that mattered as much as this moment, this choice, this love that had grown in the most unlikely of places. Rose had fled through Thornfield House's corridors, seeking any sanctuary she could find. She had burst through a door expecting nothing but temporary refuge. Instead, she had found forever. And Alexander, who had hidden himself away in northern isolation, believing he deserved nothing but solitude and penance, had opened that door to discover that redemption had been waiting all along. Not in forgiveness from society or absolution for past mistakes, but in the fierce love of a woman who saw his scars and called them beautiful, who looked at the monster and found a man, who chose him freely and completely, and in doing so, gave them both the greatest gift of all, the freedom to love and be loved in return. My lovely family, if you made it this far, you just spent over an hour with Rose and Alexander. You laughed with them, cried with them, and celebrated their happy ending. All I ask in return is 3 simple things. Subscribe so you never miss the next epic love story. Like this video so YouTube knows you want more content like this. And share it. Tag a friend who loves romance, post it to your book club, send it to your romance reading group chat. Someone in your life needs this story today. Don't let them miss out because you were too busy to share. These stories live or die by your support. And tell me in the comments section your favorite part of the story. I want to know which scene made your heart race the fastest. Was it the dramatic door scene when Rose burst into Alexander's study and he claimed her as his betrothed to save her from Thomas? Or the part where they both revealed their deepest traumas and found healing in each other's honesty? Or the part where they finally confessed their real feelings had grown far beyond their convenient arrangement? Or was it the final confrontation when Alexander brought Thomas to justice and then knelt before Rose with a true proposal? Or was it something else entirely? Tell me in the comments section. Are you Team Alexander or Team Rose? I will love to know. So please, if you enjoyed Rose and Alexander's journey from desperate strangers to soulmates, show me right now. I need to know you're still here. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.